safety. We're going to give it just a few minutes to allow people to log in, and then we'll go ahead and get. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. As of last night with wildfire smokes across California, we had 9 wildfires as of last night. Last year for us, our division, we had 3 communities that was affected by the wildfire smoke. So they are real and they're happening as we speak. We're fortunate to have Patrick Cochran today as our trainer. Patrick has over 20 years of experience with Cal OSHA, and 5 of those years was as a training coordinator. And that training included enforcement and consultation. I've had the opportunity to be in several of Patrick's trainings. Patrick is an amazing resource and who truly wants our workers to be safe and to be in compliance. At the end, we will have a Q&A. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box below. There will be certificates for people that have registered. And if you are logging on with your phone, if you could give Laura Barber a call, the person where you registered, she will be able to get your email address and I can get the certificate out to you. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Patrick and I want to thank you, Patrick, for helping us out.
Thank you, Rod. I appreciate that nice introduction, and it's always a pleasure seeing you on one of these, or it's probably more fun in the field, but here we are today over Zoom. And I want to thank the Building Industry Association for inviting me to talk about this topic. It's an important topic, and as Rod noted, wildfire season is upon us. So what I'd like to do today is to go through the basics of the wildfire Cal OSHA standard, which is numbered 5141.1. You don't have to worry about the numbering, but that's, you'll see it. I'll go through some slides here and answer some questions. As you can see in this Zoom format, we've got a couple of buttons on the bottom strip there. And so if you have a question, you can, I mean, it's a small enough group. There are like 50 of us here, right? So you could just, ask your question, or you can type it into the Q&A. Right? If you're muted, then just type your question into the Q&A, and then Rob will feed it to me and I'll answer it, when it's appropriate, or definitely at the end. I'll do my best to answer the questions. It's a new regulation, newish, and I'm interested in your questions. And I have to say up front that with a new regulation, sometimes we don't always have all the answers because it's, an idea that hasn't been fleshed out completely. And hopefully we can be satisfied with that. But if it's just a question about what the regulation says or some basic interpretations, then I should be able to help you out. And again, it's great to be back with Southern California's BIA. They're a great group, and Cal OSHA Consultation, who I work for, always enjoys partnering with this group. It's an important partner for worker health and safety. So I'm going to show you my slides now, and we'll proceed. Okay. So from the beginning, that's me on the bottom. That's the name of the regulation on the top: Protection from Wildfire Smoke, 5141. That's Title 8 California Code of Regulations. So I don't want to make this about the regulations, but let's talk about the hazard of wildfire smoke. Wildfire smoke, when we have these terrible air quality events, it actually leads to an increase in visits to the ER and, mortality of people that breathe these small particulates. And in 2019, in the middle of the summer, like July 19th, I think, or July 29th is what's on the date here. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle. The state created an emergency regulation because the wildfire season was just so bad, and workers were working outdoors and breathing in this particulate, and their health was definitely being affected. So a little bit more than, or I guess almost exactly 2 years ago, an emergency standard was created in California to protect outdoor workers from wildfire smoke. Now, in February of this year, that emergency standard became permanent. And you're probably familiar with like the COVID emergency standard. So imagine they make the COVID standard permanent. Let's hope they don't do that, right? I don't think they're, that's in the works, but that's kind of the idea. They can take an emergency standard and the board votes on it and they make it permanent. So what happens then is, all of these things are going to be in the regulations going forward. And this standard applies in a couple of basic scenarios where the current air quality index, or AQI, and I'll talk about what that means in a second, for PM 2.5, that's small particles, and we'll discuss that too. If that number is over 151, regardless of the AQI for other pollutants, we'll talk about that. And it's reasonable to assume that employees can be exposed to wildfire smoke. Now, you should know, if you listen to the news in the morning or on the radio, especially down in the South area in the Los Angeles basin, they'll sometimes say on the radio, oh, AQI is going to be 185 today. That is not the AQI for PM 2.5. That's the AQI for a bunch of different things together. So we want to focus just on the air quality index for this thing called PM 2.5, which is basically very, very small particles in smoke, which are the most dangerous to our health. So if you see a high AQI, you have to ask, oh, is there a wildfire nearby? And then we dig a little bit deeper. Just as a reminder, a little bit of background here. These PM 2.5 particles are super small. You look at that top right, that's a particulate matter of 2.5 microns. That's 2.5 millionths of a meter in diameter. Those are small particles. But in occupational health, we're worried about the small particles because those are the ones that get deep into your lungs and they don't come out, right? And so small particles are important for our health when we're breathing them. I don't know if any of you are history buffs, but back in the 1950s, in the city of London, Churchill was the prime minister, and he lost his prime minister race, like the election, because the coal-fired power plants of London pumped out a bunch of dirty coal. They had an inversion, and it killed hundreds of people because the soot just stood over the city of London for like a week, and hundreds of people died. This stuff does kill people, and that coal soot is mostly these small particles of PM 2.5. So the issue of whether or not PM 2.5 is bad for you has been decided long ago, right? So that's the component of wildfire smoke that we're worried about. And the EPA has monitors all over the country, as well as other agencies. They have monitors all over the country just measuring this one thing, particulate matter of 2.5 microns in diameter. It's small, it's bad for you. And so that's a little bit of background. So the nice thing is it's easy to not be covered by this standard if you work indoors, right? So for construction and agriculture and oil field services and things like that, it's difficult because we're working outdoors. But for some major industries, they're exempt from this standard. And here are the major exemptions. Anybody working inside a building with an HVAC system, right? If the HVAC system has mechanical filtration, you keep the doors and windows open, except when people have to enter and exit and that kind of thing, then you're exempt from the standard. So it's only really about outdoor workers. B here is if you drive around in a vehicle that has a cabin air filter. Now, some of you in construction might know about, like in the silica standard for construction, it talks about like you're not covered by the standard if you have enclosed cabs in your vehicles and it has a MERV 13 or better filter or whatever. It doesn't have any of that here. This is just if you're in a vehicle that has a cabin air filter, standard doesn't apply, all right? But a lot of us have trucks we drive around to various job sites, but then we get out for pretty extended periods of time. And I wanted to point out down here in D, where it says employees exposed to a current AQI of PM 2.5 of 151 or greater for a total of 1 hour or less. So if you drove around in your truck, but were out in the open for less than an hour, you also would be exempt. And a lot of the transportation and logistics companies wanted this because the truck driver's driving around in an air-conditioned cab, but yeah, they have to get out during loading and unloading, but for limited periods of time, right? So if you're just sort of transient going around and going from one building to the other, and you're just walking between your truck and an indoor location for less than an hour per shift, then you're also not covered by this standard. C is the tricky one, right? C says you're not covered by the standard if maybe the AQI says it's over 151, but you have your own air monitoring equipment that says that you're below 151. If you're going to do that, you need an industrial hygienist or somebody very trained in the equipment to make sure that it's working properly. Contact me if that's something you're interested in. It does come up, particularly with utility companies working in very rural areas where there aren't a lot of these air quality sensors. But if you're in a populated area with a bunch of air quality sensors, it doesn't make a ton of sense to do it. But it has come up with like PG&E folks out helping in the wildland interface, the fire interface, restoring power or cutting off power to areas. And they might think that like the nearest sensor says it's above 500, but they have their sampling instrument that says in this little valley, the AQI is lower. So in any case, if you want to do your own air monitoring and prove that your folks are not exposed in the particular area that they're working in outdoors, you can do that, but it's a pretty high bar. In fact, one of the appendices, Appendix A, tells you how to do that. So, and then lastly, if you're a firefighter engaged in wildland firefighting, you're exempt from this regulation, but they have a bunch of other regulations they have to comply with, right? So, and they often do wear respirators. That's been a bone of contention with OSHA, but there are other rules that the firefighters have to deal with. They're in some pretty extreme conditions. So, some definitions in the standard. There's a very complex definition with a bunch of algorithms about what the AQI is, right? But we're interested in the AQI just for the PM 2.5. That's the small particles, right? And the particle, I mean, when there's a fire in a forest, it's burning off like the sap and the moisture in the leaves. And there's like suspended liquids and particles and solids in there. All of that smoke that's really small, 2.5 microns or less, is what we measure and what we're worried about, right? There's a definition for wildfire smoke. It's actually mentioned in another section of Title 8 in the for wildlands. And like if you're in a urban wildland interface, like in Coffee, the area of the Coffee neighborhood in Santa Rosa, for instance, where the forest fire burns into the neighborhood and now the neighborhood is burning. If you're including that material in the house, it's very different composition than wildland fire smoke, but you're also covered by this standard, right? Because it's mostly wildfire smoke. Okay, so there are a couple of important definitions here. What does the standard tell employers they have to do? The first step, the first thing we should be doing is trying to figure out what the AQI for PM 2.5 is, right? What is the air quality index for PM 2.5 in the area where my crew is working? You're required to check at the beginning of each shift. There are a million different ways to do this. I'm going to show you a couple here in a second. You can go to a bunch of these websites. I listed them there. The EPA's Air Now, Interagency Wildland Fire Air Quality Response Program, Forest Service, California Air Resources Board, your local AQMD. There's like a bunch of places you can get this information. But just like you are responsible for figuring out if you're going to have a high heat day, right? Remember, and you're in construction, if it's going to be really high heat that day, you have to implement high heat procedures and be prepared at the beginning of the shift for that to happen. Just think of this as another thing to put on that list. We're trying to figure out if we're going to have a high AQI day, all right? And you have to figure it out at the beginning of each shift. I'll show you a couple of ways that I like to get this. You can have these agencies email you. You put your zip code into the email, into the website, and the agency will send you a daily email or, more often as the AQI changes. You can do that, or you can download an app on your phone. And I'll show you a couple of these apps, right? So on the left, you have my preferred app, which is airnow.gov. This is the EPA's app that they created. And AirNow is a great one, but I have to say a bunch of people in Southern California have recommended the South Coast Air Quality Management District's app too. And they probably have some local knowledge that, AirNow does not, or access to other sampling devices that are out there. So find one that works for you. I like AirNow in Northern California, but these are a couple of examples of these agencies that have apps, and I would have every line supervisor responsible for this. Like they're looking up the temperature every day, right? to see if it's going to be a high heat day if they're a crew doing construction. And I'm assuming most people here are in construction. So why not just have them, okay, whoever's looking up the heat conditions on the job site that day, have them also look up the air quality conditions that day. Easy enough. So I have family all over Northern California. In fact, several of my relatives have had their houses burned out. This is just 2 days ago. I have relatives that lived a little bit to the east of the Dixie Fire, which is 210,000 acres right now, which is like 300 square miles is burning or has burnt. And that's just one of many fires in Northern California. So on the left, you see the main screen for the zip code that you put in, right? This happens to be Loyalton, California, and Sierra County. And at 2 p.m., the AQI was 405. Now, remember I told you the AQI, the total AQI, is a combination of a bunch of different things. They measure large particles, small particles, ozone, and a couple of other things, right? So when you go into the details, you see the details tab there, it'll tell you what the primary pollutants are that make up that total AQI. So we want to go in there and look for, on the right, PM 2.5, what that AQI number says, because that's the one that tells us where we stand for this standard. We're not interested in ozone for this standard. We're not interested in PM 10, which is larger particles. We're just interested in the reading for PM 2.5, which is the small particles, 2.5 microns in diameter or less, which is super, super small. All right, questions on that? You can always send them in. Now, you can also put in your name and address and all that kind of stuff and tell them what city you're working in. You can go to the AirNow website and they will send you an email telling you what the AQI is. So this is another way of figuring out what the conditions are. Really easy to do. If you're moving around, you just change the city selection or the zip code selection, and it'll tell you what the AQI is in the new city that you're working in. So I recommend doing this, especially if you're working in one town a lot. Just they'll send you an email on a regular basis telling you what it is. You can get an RSS feed too. In fact, their website's pretty heavy on, hey, we'll get you an RSS feed. I'll be honest, I'm not a techie. I don't know what that is. I think that's sort of like a text thing. But I've heard that you can get those RSS feeds sent to your text or email right away. All right, so the first thing we're doing is figuring out, are we supposed to be worried about wildfires this morning or not, right? At the beginning of each shift. You can look at it the night before because they'll give you a forecast, but at least at the beginning of each shift, we figure out whether or not air quality for PM 2.5 is going to be a problem. The next thing is we have to communicate with our employees. What are we going to do about it, right? Is it a high AQI day? Is it going to be over 150? So 151 or greater is where we have to take some sort of action, right? So we have to use the procedures in our IIPP, the Injury and Illness Prevention Program, Regulation 3203, right? We already have to have a system for communicating to employees. And most construction employers have a pre-shift meeting. I would recommend making it part of that, but you can do whatever your IIPP says, right? Just a side note, at Cal OSHA Consultation, we work with a ton of employers. You can talk to Rod. We'll deal with a lot of your subcontractors and go through their IIPP and other programs. And most often what we find is that you're doing a bunch of really good things that you didn't put in your IIPP because you put that together 10 years ago with a consultant, right? So what we would encourage you to do is like figure out what you're doing that works, change your IIPP's communication portion to meet what you're really doing. And whatever your IIPP says that you're not doing, get rid of it, right? So small, concise, precise is what we want out of our IIPP. So if your IIPP says daily pre-job safety meetings, pre-job inspections, and that's also when we communicate about the heat situation, you can also make that when you communicate about the air quality situation. You have to encourage employees, like this is a proactive thing you have to do. You have to get employees involved, especially if you send a crew out and that you don't have a foreman with them or a supervisor or superintendent with them all the time. Hey, let us know if there's a fire nearby and the air quality is getting obviously worse, right? Or if you're having any symptoms that could be related to worsening air quality, because you're going to want to know that, right? And this regulation requires that communication be, outlined in your IIPP or some heat element or some wildfire smoke specific procedures. Okay, next thing. So we have to train people on the hazards of wildfire smoke and what the employer is going to do. This is a very vanilla slide. Something unique about this, or not unique, but interesting about this training provision is it does say that if you have a non-English speaking population, you have to provide the training in a manner that the employees will understand. So if you have a population of workers that speaks largely Spanish, you have to provide the training on your wildfire smoke procedures in a language that they understand, right? And so like a lot of regulations don't actually explicitly say that, but this one does, and bear that in mind. It might be appropriated in a construction environment. So the nice thing is the division created a training program. It's in Appendix B. Now, there's a bit of a model program aspect to Appendix B. We'll talk about that here in a second, but you have to do some work to put in your training program. What are your methods of communication, and what controls are you going to undertake when the smoke levels get bad, right? So that makes sense. If you don't outline that stuff, OSHA can't write it for you. But a lot of the other stuff, the information on, what is wildfire smoke? Why is it bad? What do the rules say? It's in the appendix of the regulation. It's 2 pages long. You can have a tailgate and knock it out in a pretty reasonable amount of time, as long as you outline what your communication method is and you follow it, and what steps you're going to take as an employer if the smoke gets really bad. Now, I should say that this standard has been around for a couple of years, and I work with VPP construction employers, general contractors, and trade partners all over the state, mostly Northern California, but all over the state. And a couple of years ago, we had really terrible fires up in the Sacramento area, and we were on a VPP job. The AQI got above 400 and was getting into the 500 range. And as you'll see, you really have to be prepared to make a couple of decisions at that point, because there are 2 thresholds in this standard. One is the AQI of 151, and the other is the AQI of 500, as we'll see. So this is what you do when the AQI goes above 150. We here are a couple of rules. In emergencies, you just provide respiratory protection, right? So that's like assisting in emergency response and that sort of thing. Just like in every other health standard that OSHA has, we require you to use the hierarchy of controls. Now, this is not always easy, and it's not always feasible, particularly in construction. It's not going to be feasible to put everybody indoors or give everybody filtered air or something like that, right? But if it is feasible to do something in the realm of engineering controls, you have to try to do it. That's what number 2 says there. Number 3 is administrative control. So administrative controls is like training or job rotation or lessening the rate of work or things like that. So there are a bunch of ideas in the training section about how you reduce the impact of wildfire smoke on outdoor workers that are working really hard. Now, this is just something that's harmful to us that we're breathing. So to the extent that you can lower their metabolic rate, like more breaks, or lower the rate of breathing, or provide them with some sort of rotation in and out of exposed areas, that's an administrative control. And you have to think up some of those things if you can. And there are a bunch of examples in the training. I mentioned a few. And then lastly, respiratory protection. Now, I'm going to say a couple things about respiratory protection because it's a topic that can last hours on its own. It's pretty complicated, but most of the wildfire smoke standard is going to be in the realm of voluntary use of respirators. So if you use a respirator for voluntary use, there's a couple things you have to do. You have to give people some sort of basic training, which is the training that is outlined in Appendix B, right? That would suffice. If you're using filtering facepiece respirators, like the one indicated there at the bottom, then that's pretty much it, right? You give them the training in Appendix B, you show them how to put it on, don and doff, and that they're fine. It's voluntary use. They don't even really technically have to be clean shaven because it's voluntary use, but you have to train them that the thing only works, it works much better if you're clean shaven, right? But if you're going to provide people with elastomeric facepiece respirators, even under voluntary use, it's a much higher burden, right? you have to do things like medical evaluations and what have you, right? And have a written program for certain elements. And so my personal advice to my clients is stick with filtering face piece respirators, just like with COVID, right? If you are in a situation where you want to wear a respirator, stick with the voluntary use, because all that's really required is that you give them a copy of Appendix D or do a brief training on what respirators are, show them a donning and doffing video, which OSHA has created now. And that's fairly simple to do. But when you get your AQI reading in the morning and it says it's going to be more than 151, you have to offer these filtering face piece respirators, or you have to offer respirators for voluntary use to your crew. So again, I recommend just doing filtering face piece respirators, not the elastomeric ones, until you hit the PM 2.5 of 500, right? If you are in an area where the PM 2.5 is 500 or greater, you're going to know it. It's going to be all over the news. They're going to be fire trucks dashing by you. That's a really high level. I think in our area, we had a PM 2.5 of greater than 500, like 3 days when we had a lot of fires in 2019, when this emergency standard came into effect. We had about 3 days where it was over 500, and like my kid's school shut down. Like it's so noticeable. It's tough to breathe. Everybody's staying inside, and it's bad. But if you have your workers working outdoors and the PM 2.5 level is greater than 500, you have to put them in a mandatory respirator program. And a mandatory respirator program means medical evaluation, fit testing, training, a program administrator of the respiratory protection program that knows what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I would ask you to do is decide now, right? What are you going to do when it hits 500? You've already got folks in voluntary use respirators. You can't fit test them all in one day, right? At the time that happens, when people wait that long, you run out of fit testing materials, you don't have your written program completed, suddenly you're out of compliance with all this respiratory protection regulations. So decide now, we're going to pull our people out of the field and pull them indoors, or send them to another location or whatever. Because if you leave them outdoors working at a AQI of greater than 500, and they're in voluntary respirators, you're in violation, right? You're in violation. So most construction companies don't want to fit test every single one of their outdoor workers for respirators. You could do that and you'd be ready to go. A lot of utility companies are doing that now because, like I said, PG&E in Southern California, Edison, they have to restore the lines near these very smoky areas. Do your fit testing and your written program and your medical evaluation and all that kind of stuff now, if that's what you're going to do. If you know your workers are essential workers and they have to be out there near the fire line or downwind of a very bad fire when the AQI is above 500, make that decision now, right? And you should, because you don't want to be in the situation where, wow, this job is absolutely vital. I cannot pull them out of the field. Yes, it's smoky. And now I have to fit test 50 workers, this morning. You can't do it, right? It's going to take you like a week if doing it full time to fit test that many workers. And so a bunch of people ran across the situation where they tried to do it in the Sacramento area. Every single fit testing equipment set in Northern California was already purchased, and they were back ordered on every site at that point. Because when we had the really bad smoke days in the Sacramento area, everybody said, oh, I need to fit test my people. And you couldn't get the fit testing materials because everybody wanted them on the same day, right? So anyway, that's my 2 cents on something that can help your company be prepared for this and going forward. The other thing on that level, and I'll say it now, is for filtering face piece respirators like the N95s, you can't use the foreign KN95s that you might have on stockpile from the surge days of COVID. Those are decent for source control for COVID for indoor unvaccinated workers. That's what you should save them for. But they have to be NIOSH certified respirators. And I'll show you that the division actually has a website where they collect the names of vendors that claim that they have large numbers of NIOSH certified respirators available for sale. So the division is not currently accepting like, oh, I couldn't get my N95s, they're not available, so I bought thousands of these KN95s, and now that's what we're using. They're not respirators. They're not respirators. They don't apply in the standard. For a brief period of time during the early days of the COVID surge, some foreign made and foreign certified respirators were given emergency use authorization by the FDA. That has since lapsed. So now I recommend if you have any KN95s or something like that, then use them for source control for unvaccinated workers working indoors. That's what they're good for. For wildfire smoke and for COVID, hopefully you're not in a COVID situation in the building industry. But you have to have a NIOSH certified respirator. So buy them now, right? Just like that decision on what we're gonna do for the high AQI, buy your respirators now because they're available. You can buy thousands of them, and they're not cheap. I'm not suggesting that, but there's not a shortage. There are companies that are making them by the millions in the United States now. All right, so this is that's basically the end of the standard, and I might have gone through that a little bit too quickly. I hope not. By all means, click on the Q&A and ask your questions, and Rod will feed them to me when we finish this. Or if there's something appropriate for you to interrupt me, feel free. I mean, like I said, it's a small enough group. So here's an appendix to the standard that says basically if you're in a rural area and there aren't a lot of sensors for air quality, and that happens in Northern California, right? If in the Forest Service lands, and you've got a bunch of Forest Service lands in Cleveland, Toyah down in Southern California, and other types of national forest lands, there are not a lot of air sensors. And so if you have to work out there and you think that the air quality is good where you are, but bad where the sensor is, you can always do your own readings. And this device on the right is a direct read particulate meter, and they use it for, in some cases for silica, although it's kind of hard to do. This requires an industrial hygienist or somebody who's really good with instrumentation to figure out how to do this, because you calibrate it with one type of dust and then you have to figure out how to use a correction factor for wildfire smoke. So it's a bit of a bear, but they wanted to give this as an option to people because, like I said, there are folks, utility companies and folks that work around in wildland firefighting support that really do believe like, hey, that sensor is 20 miles away and the air quality is totally different here. I don't want to have my people in respirators. So then they have a sample at the incident command center or something like that. It does happen. I've been involved in a couple of those incident command issues with big wildfires, and they'll have an industrial hygienist doing air monitoring at the incident command post. So anyway, that's one, inside baseball part of this. I don't recommend this for construction employers, but it's there for you. And then Appendix B is the training. I appreciate that the division did this. I worked for enforcement 10 years ago, and then was in training, and now I'm in consultation. And I was always frustrated that there weren't better resources available for employers to comply with the standard, right? And so they created this appendix that's basically the training. If you go through this with your employees and fill out a couple of important things about your company, you've complied with the standard in large part, with the training portion of the standard, right? You go through the Appendix B and it basically says, why is wildfire smoke bad? Like, what are the health effects? That's good for people to know. That employees have the right to get medical treatment if they feel, they're having some sort of respiratory issue or heart issue because of the wildfire smoke. How do you get the AQI? So you talk a little bit about the websites or the apps and things like that. The requirements of this section, what the employer's communication system is, how do you remove employees from wildfire smoke, a little bit about respirators, how to put on, use, and maintain the respirators provided by the employer. So I will say this, that as an employer, you decide you're going to buy 5,000 or 1,000 of these N95 respirators of one type or another, maybe one or two type. The insert of all NIOSH approved respirators has donning and doffing instructions. So you just blow those up. You can get them on a PDF and go through it. It's a pretty simple donning and doffing videos. The division created a donning and doffing video on YouTube, and I'm sorry I didn't put a link to it here. I have some other links for you, but it's narrated by a former office tech of mine who did a great job. And they basically go through for about 5 to 8 minutes how to put on and take off a filtering face piece respirator safely and make sure that it fits your face and all that kind of stuff. It's called a user seal check donning and doffing video, but you can check DIR's YouTube page. It's on there. But some respirators are a little bit different. You know, they might differ in which strap they want you to put on first, or at what point do you bend the nose clip or whatever. So you want to use the instructions for the respirators you buy for your people. That's an important point. But generally speaking, the donning and doffing and the user seal checks are pretty similar amongst all filtering face piece respirators. If you're using elastomeric face piece respirators, call me or something. It's harder, right? I have some guidance for you. I don't blame you for doing that because aren't as many consumables. The cartridges can last longer and there's some benefit, especially for a small employer, to do that. But there are additional burdens doing a voluntary use program on an elastomeric face piece respirator, like a half face elastomeric with the HEPA cartridges. You know, that happens to be what I use under mandatory use. Okay, a couple of highlights here. This is the instructions on the respirator donning and doffing, and some thoughts that you should share with your employees. This picture is taken from a respiratory protection guide. This guy in this picture used to work for Cal OSHA Consultation. He just retired. He was with the publications unit, and poor Russ just walked into retirement earlier this year. But he's famous because now he's memorialized inside the appendix of the regulation for wildfire smoke. But it talks a little bit about how to properly wear a respirator. Again, check the insert for the respirators you wear, that you buy. A couple of resources here. So DOSH has a page on wildfire resources and a little bit about the regulations and other things. Here, direct your attention to the blue box in the middle of this page here. This is where you can go for a list of vendors who tell Cal OSHA that they have available supplies, at least 100,000 NIOSH certified disposable N95 respirators. Now, I created this slideshow, or I updated this slideshow earlier in July. I just checked this morning. They had updated this more recently in July. So the vendor list is constantly being updated. So this effort is part of the reason why the division is not really accepting people's claims that, oh, I can't find respirators right now. Because the division is actually pinging or seeking out vendors for N95 filtering face piece respirators and verifying that they have thousands of them in warehouses all over the country ready to be shipped to you. All right. But this is a good page for all kinds of information about wildfire. There's an FAQ. I think I might have a slide on the FAQ. Oh, okay. Before I talk about the FAQ, so that Appendix B that I mentioned, the training on wildfire smoke, has been turned into a video created by Cal OSHA's professional development and training unit. And you can access this on YouTube. The link is there. And I'll send a PDF of these slides to the facilitators. They can send them out to folks that ask. But you can watch this video, and it talks a little bit about the requirements to protect workers exposed to wildfire smoke. One thing that I would just add is that, remember, Cal OSHA can't determine what your company's method of communication is that you have to document, and Cal OSHA cannot determine what methods your company is going to take to control your exposure, right? So as an employer, you have to decide what you're going to do to control exposure. But the other information, it's in this video. And the division, because of COVID, I think, has gotten a little bit better at creating videos. Like I mentioned, the donning and doffing and user seal check videos that we created for filtering face piece respirators, but wanted to make these resources known to you. There's an FAQ for the wildfire smoke regulation and wildfire hazards. It's broken down into common questions we receive from employers, as well as common questions we receive from employees. And some of your most basic questions might be answered here. And again, part of the reason we do outreach is to hear your questions. And if we can't answer them, we go back and we huddle and try to figure out what they are. We get together with our legal unit and research and standards, and we'll add to the FAQs. For the last year and a half, that's what I've been doing with COVID. People call with unusual questions, and if we get enough of them, we'll add questions to the COVID FAQs. So your input is a valuable part of why we do outreach and it's a valuable part of making the FAQs better. So please send in your questions. My contact information is at the end of this slideshow, but I do want to hear from you if you have some good questions. Or and then lastly, I wanted to open up the floor to questions. I wanted to show you this. This is the new normal in California, apparently. This is the Beckworth fire in Northern California, north of Truckee, and happened to be up there for Little League playoffs. And my nephew's on the mound here, and it's a crazy, the mountain behind them was on fire, and the wind was blowing in another direction, and people were staring at it in disbelief. We just play ball. That's what we do, as long as the wind's blowing in the other direction. But this is what we're going to be faced with for the next few years in California, it looks like. And hopefully for our workers out there, we can take these reasonable steps to protect them. Remember, first identifying and finding out what the AQI for PM 2.5 is, and then taking it from there. So with that, I was originally scheduled to talk for 45 minutes. I think I went a little bit less than that. So if anyone has any questions or any thoughts, please send them my way. And Rod, any questions from the field?
Yes, Patrick, we have 5 of them. First one is in our industry, building the homes, at what point would OSHA consider the house being wrapped where the workers would be considered indoors? And does it have to have air conditioning? Does it have to be conditioned?
So you have to have a mechanical ventilation system where the air is filtered. It doesn't say that it has to be cooled or heated. So if the envelope's on, it's going through some air handlers. The air inside the building is going through some air handlers that filter the air. Then that means that you're indoors. In fact, that's what happened at a big project that I was working on in the Sacramento area. They just pulled their outdoor workers indoor because they got the envelope on, and they closed the doors, and they turned on some fans, and they had filters on the fans and the air handling system. They actually ran it up and down the elevator shaft, right? And which is not uncommon during a building before they connect the internal HVAC system. But as long as that air is filtered and you've got a mechanical ventilation system, it doesn't say like HVAC with a MERV 13 filter or anything like that. It's just you're indoors, air is filtered, mechanical ventilation system. You can even build it, right? Anybody that's worked in the asbestos or lead or mold or remediation business, they know they can seal a building and just, normally you would seal the building and then have like an air hog on the outside filtering the air that's going out to make sure no asbestos or lead went out. You could do it in reverse because those fans reverse, seal the building and filter the air going into the building. I mean, that's you got to be creative if you want to be able to work while the AQI is higher than 500.
Yeah, I think for us in our industry, at that point, when we have power like that, we're ready to move the homeowners in. So for us, I don't think it would apply. The second question is, can we get a copy of this presentation?
Yeah. I will create a PDF and send it to all of the presenters, and they can distribute it as they want.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick, for that. The next one is, will we need to create a wildfire smoke written program?
Yeah, so that's what the Appendix B. So you have to document a couple of things, right? You have to provide training and instruction, and in order to do that, you have to put the means of communication and what your company is going to do as part of the training. If you trained people using Appendix B and filled in those lines of what your communication methods are and what steps you're going to take to control the hazards, that's the documentation that would be needed. But there's not like a written plan requirement, but if you didn't do those things, like if you didn't, we'd ask, okay, what did your training say about these items? I would recommend that you have that in writing just as filled in on Appendix B, so that you can show that that's what you trained your people on. But to back up and say, do you have to have a wildfire smoke plan? No, I don't see that anywhere in the standard. You have to do the things that the standard requires of you. And one of the ways of doing that is to fill out Appendix B properly, do that training. And I think that's actually one of the nice things about this standard is they don't seem to be creating this additional burden for a wildfire smoke written plan. But it's not a bad idea to have some procedures that reflect what you're doing.
Very good. Thank you, Patrick. The next question is, can an employer require workers to wear filtered face respirators when exposed to a PM 2.5 greater than, with the AQI greater than 151?
An employer can. Okay, so a couple of things here. You can do that, but if you require respirator use, it's no longer voluntary. That's the trick, right? If you say my employees have to wear this filtering face piece respirator, then it's not voluntary anymore, right? So the interesting thing about voluntary use is it's available if they ask for it, right? You're not even required to give everybody an N95 mask. It's available if they ask for it. And this standard actually says you encourage them to wear it when the AQI is above 151. But if they say, no, thanks, boss, I don't want it. Can an employer require it? Yes, but then you're in a mandatory program, and that means medical evaluation, fit testing, training, written program administrator, right? So you don't want to be in that position of doing that unless you're prepared to have a respiratory protection program that covers all of your outdoor workers, all right? So that's kind of a tricky one because we want to protect our people. So we have an instinct in health and safety is like, yeah, you have to wear your hard hat even when there's not an overhead hazard. Yeah, you have to wear your gloves everywhere on this job site because that's just our rules. With respirators, it's a little tricky, right? If you require it, it's no longer voluntary. And so you lose that exemption to all of those other respiratory protection requirements. So that's a great question. I appreciate whoever asked it.
So Patrick, so let's say the AQI is, say, 300. And for whatever reason, OSHA enforcement shows up on your site, and here's these workers with no N95s on. So would the builder be responsible for that?
So I spent 5 years training compliance officers on how to do their job. And so what they would end up doing is saying, wow, it's high AQI. Then nobody's wearing respirators and note that in their records probably somewhere. But then they have to ask the supervisor. They have to interview. They're required to interview employees, and they should be asking them, were you offered a filtering face piece respirator at some point? Were you informed that they were available to you? And then did your employer recommend that you wear it? Those are the important things that the standard requires, because the standard requires that you provide them upon request and encourage them to wear it when the AQI is high. If the employer has done those things and nobody's wearing a respirator, there's no violation, right? Now, is that going to save you from a zealous enforcement officer making a mistake? No, nothing does, but that's what the appeals process is for, right? Everybody makes mistakes. But the standard is very clear. Voluntary use is voluntary use. If you're required to wear it, it wouldn't be called voluntary use.
Very good. That helps out a lot, Patrick. Thank you. The last question is, would it be wise to add a section to the job site apps within the site reports where they can post daily AQI numbers as they do with temperatures?
That is a fantastic idea, and it's something that we recommend to all of our VPPC clients. The general is there. It's sort of a fixed facility for the general for an extended period of time, weeks, months, years even. And so they're doing daily checks for heat to see if the shade has to be up. They're doing daily checks for heat to see if they're going to be, in the high heat procedures. Why not have a pre-shift, a line in there for what is the AQI expected to be at the beginning of the shift, right? Because they can forecast what the AQI will be that day. But then if it's anywhere near 150, you're going to want to update it because it says you have to check it at the beginning of the shift and periodically thereafter. And then employees can report to you like, hey, boss, the smoke is really bad. You check the AQI again. But yeah, absolutely. Documenting it. So just like so many things, right? If you do something and you don't document it, it's so much harder to prove that you didn't do it. Yeah, you're not required to have a written wildfire plan, but if you had Appendix B filled out and you documented that you did that training, you're better off maintaining that documentation, right?
Very good. Well, I'm reluctant to remind everybody about your email address and your phone number there on the screen, because when I call you, I appreciate it when you answer the phone when I call. But I highly recommend that everybody on this call gets Patrick's phone number there and his email address, and utilize him as a resource. He's an amazing trainer, and he's always willing to help and support us. And it looks like we got one other question on here.
I just want to note that like CalOSHA consultation, we get paid by the federal government mostly to help small high hazard employers. So if you have questions, we can answer them over the phone. As Rod knows, we can come out to your job sites. It doesn't have to be a VPPC project. We have great consultants in Southern California, seniors, associates that can come out and help you go through your plans, look at your job site, offer you advice. We will meet you where you're at. And it's against the law for us to tell CalOSHA enforcement who we work with, right? So you are our client, we protect your identity, and we take that very seriously. We just happen to be, managed by the same person that manages CalOSHA enforcement, but we are totally a separate organization. Just wanted to throw that in, that little plug for our great consultants in Southern California, Rod.
Patrick, one other question that just came in, and it says, how many respirators are we required to provide the workers when the AQI is higher than 151?
So again, you're only required to offer them to the people who ask for them, right? Although you let them know that they're available and that you want them to wear them. But if they say, hey, okay, I want one. So generally the question is, it's getting towards like, how many should I stockpile, right? And it's tough to know because you don't know how bad the air quality is going to be and for how long. But generally speaking, and this is just a generalization, but often these single-use respirators are good for about a day, right? They get dirty, they get contaminated on the inside. All of them are a little bit different if you read the instructions, right? You have to handle them a different way. Some of them can be used on multiple days if they're in good shape and they're maintained in between the shifts and all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, if you're wearing an N95 under voluntary use each day for a couple of days, you're going to want a new one for each day, right? Technically, if they get totally filthy and torn, you might need more than one in a shift. It depends on what the person is doing. So no one at CalOSHA or even at the manufacturers will give you a number of how many per day, because it depends on what they're doing, right? As long as the thing is clean and in good condition, you might be able to reuse it, right? But generally one per shift is a good number. And then you don't know, it depends on how many people are using it and how many days you anticipate the AQI being above 151. So that, I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I'm not going to say 42 because it's just.
No, I think that's a good answer. I appreciate it. Well, anything else, Patrick?
Another question came in from Troy C that asks, shouldn't our trade partners be responsible for providing their employees an N95 mask? Absolutely, Troy. Because I talk about general contractors and rods from Shea and I talk about VPP generals all the time. Let's be very clear. The person who is who directs and controls the employees is responsible for providing the filtering face piece respirators or other respirators if they choose to do that. As a general, we can ask about how deeply do we want to get into this? And it's something that you're probably all very familiar with, trying to figure out people wearing masks indoors and outdoors during COVID, right? How you see a bunch of people not wearing masks recently, you're wondering, oh, you must be vaccinated. How much do I want to dig into that? That's a much larger question. We're getting into the multi-employer world, but it's the same here, right? If nobody's wearing it and it's very smoky, you might want to ask as the general, or you will want to ask, hey, did you offer them N95 respirators? Do you have a wildfire smoke, procedures? What are you doing here? But yes, I'm turning a short answer into a long one. it's the employer, it's the trade partner, it's the subcontractor's responsibility to provide those N95 respirators. Thank you for adding that question.
Yeah, thank you, Troy. Yeah, I think that's it right now for what we have.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you everyone for your attention. My contact information is on the last slide, I think.
And Rod, one more thing. Again, if your username as an attendee is not something that I can make out based on your registration name, please email me. This is Laura. Just email me back to the email that I sent you the link to let me know that you were on this call, and I can compare to the usernames that are on here today. So if I can't make it out, it's not a clear name, you will not receive a certificate. So just an FYI. So again, if you're logged in with a number or not your actual name as the user there, please email me back and let me know so I can make sure you get credit.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Great job, Patrick. We appreciate all your support.
Happy to work with BIA and you, Rod.
Thank you, buddy. Okay, have a good day.
All right.